All right. Well, Lucas Wilson, your friends call you Luke, so I'll be calling you that on this podcast. It's great to have you on. You wrote a book called Shame, Sex, Attraction, an anthology of essays from conversion therapy survivors. Wow, yikes. It's great to have you. Thanks for making time.
Yo, thank you so much for having me. This is exciting to be here and to finally meet you. I, of course, know your work and am familiar with you, but this is our first time connecting.
Yeah, it's always great to have a new face on the podcast. Tell me about yourself. I mean, this book, quite the subtitle, sounds incredibly powerful. In both, I would imagine, healing ways, but also in just like, wow, these stories are wild. Yeah, give me your background. I'm so curious.
Yeah, so I'm a postdoctoral fellow, like a researcher. Not like a researcher, I suppose I am a researcher at this point, at University of Toronto, Mississauga, formerly at University of Calgary, and before that I did most of my schooling actually in the States, but back in the North. And so, yeah, I've just been, recently I've been delving into the creative writing world, and this was actually because I had an editor reach out, and they had been tracking my public-facing work on conversion therapy and my experience in conversion therapy at Liberty University. And when they were, I guess, sort of interested in putting together a collection, they tapped me and said, "Hey, would you be interested?" So I, of course, said yes. I'm in no position in my career at this point to say no. And so I agreed, and we sort of went back and forth on the details. But eventually, it turned into a collection of 17 stories, including my own, as well as a foreword by Garrett Conley, the author of Boy Erase, stories about conversion therapy. And so a wide range from 3 different countries, mostly from conservative Christian context, but also one from an Orthodox Jewish context, one from what the author describes as a Chinese cult, and then one also from a secular context. But that's the collection. Otherwise, I do research not just on the New Christian Right, and specifically in regards to gender and sexuality, but also I do work on the Holocaust and looking at the after effects and also the antecedents of the Holocaust, particularly in North America.
Well, with that pedigree, where to start? I love that. I mean, let's talk about the book. I mean, and the topic about conversion therapy. I mean, this is, I grew up very conservative, evangelical fundamentalist, and was taught that people can change their sexual orientation. There's all these different processes, and that God made you a certain way, and that same-sex attraction is just a product of the fall, etc. And as I kind of came out of that and deconstructed and just realized that the world is much bigger than me, I realized that it seems like conversion therapy is not really successful in any way, shape, or form. I mean, there was what was that Netflix movie, I think, about was it Exodus International, about just that whole world and how it just fell apart. That's I mean, from your vantage point as someone who's a researcher and does all this stuff, I mean, you had to have known this for a long time before folks like myself knew that conversion therapy is really a farce.
Yeah, you know what? I think because it's both a personal thing and also an academic thing. I mean, once I began the research, 100%, the jury was out. Conversion therapy doesn't work. It's never worked, and it will never work in the future. And I think that for me, though, similar to you, I come from the evangelical world. And for me, at the time that I was an evangelical, which was around, the beginning of grade 9, so the beginning of high school up until grad school, I believed that, in fact, you could change your sexual orientation. And of course, conversion practices or conversion therapy extend beyond just sexual orientation, also for gender identity and gender expression. But for me, personally, my big issue, quote unquote, was the fact that I was and am gay. And so because of that, I was in this world, and I was made to believe that, in fact, you had to choose, as if it's a choice,
right,
your sexuality and yourself, which of course is framed as a selfish decision, or God. And of course, for those of us in sort of high control religious context, we know that when the choice is between you and God, God's always going to win, right? So
yeah.
For me, I was made to believe that I had to change. And so if I wanted to remain within the fold, I needed to change my sexuality. And so when I eventually made a decision on where I was going to go for university, eventually Liberty University, and I think back, it's just crazy now, I had the decision between University of Toronto, which is Canada's best, and Liberty University, right?
My God.
We all make decisions.
Well, I mean, look, DC Talk did come out of Liberty University,
me.
So I understand,
They did. That was a big, big motivating factor for
big
why.
draw.
No, but when I went, that's it. And so when I went to Liberty, I knew that they had a conversion therapy program. I didn't know it as a conversion therapy program in the sense that the language I used at the time wasn't, oh, they have a conversion therapy program. Instead, it was that they have a pastor on staff who works with guys who are, quote unquote, struggling with same-sex attraction. And obviously, it's only ever a struggle because it's made into a struggle for us, right? So when I went to Liberty, that was a big, again, sort of like draw as to why I wanted to go there. And again, I did believe it. I thought that I could change. I gave it the good old college try, pun intended, and I was wildly unsuccessful. And here we are today, living that big old gay lifestyle we were warned about.
I mean, that had to be very painful for you to have this, feeling of I have to choose between loving God and being who God made me to be and my flesh, right? Because let's face it, and it's not a one-to-one, but as a straight white man, you're just taught you have to war against your flesh, aka your sexual desires, right? And so you're constantly in this headspace of battle and warring against your desires that are actually very normal and biological and just part of how your body's wired to be. And every time you made a mistake, it was this huge big deal, and yada yada. It had to be very frustrating for you, and I would imagine quite damaging for a while. Building this like alter self that had to be like against who you just were as a human, right? I mean, you were born this way. This is who you are, and these people are telling you, well, God doesn't make mistakes, so this is just a part of your sinful fleshly desires that you have to fight against, and there's a way out. That I don't know. That just has to be a real mind fuck, honestly, trying to navigate that.
Yeah. I think for queer folks within evangelical context, it's a dual sort of valence of difficulty, right? That not only do you have these desires, like sexual desires, in general, but also they're queer. And so within these sort of contexts, you're told that any sort of sexual activity or thoughts or not desires are framed as that's natural, whereas to act on them, right, is always what's the quote unquote issue. For us, it's not just that we're sexual, but it's also that we're queer on top of that, right? And so you have this double valence of sort of, taboo, a taboo part of who you are. And the problem is, of course, that for straight people, they just need to get to marriage. Once they get married, then, everything's fine and they can, have sex and everything, God's on God's throne. However, for queer people, it's not only that you have to get to marriage, but you have to find someone that you're not attracted to marry. And that, of course, is not a fun prospect. And so for me, being a queer kid, thinking like, oh man, like I just can't wait for the day that I'm finally attracted to women. And obviously that day never came. And so it's sort of this cruel optimism, right? It's like this twisted hope that you're going to eventually find something that is sort of like a unicorn of a person that never shows up. And so it's always this, not delayed gratification in the sense that there's ever gratification. It's just a delay and a delay and a delay. And it sort of strings you along until finally you can't take it. And you're like, I'm done with this. Clearly this hasn't worked. I've, again, done everything I possibly could, to try to fight this. And when it doesn't work, then you're like, okay, then I'll see myself to the door and out I go. Right.
What was the moment or the series of moments for you where you realized like, this is not tenable? Like, I'm done with this. I'm going to accept who I am, because if not, I'm not going to make it.
Yeah. So I went to Liberty for undergrad. Obviously, the biggest or largest evangelical university in the world. And when I was there, I was in 4 years of conversion therapy. So I met with this pastor over the span of my undergrad. And, when I was in these meetings with him on quite a regular basis, he always sort of like cheered me on. And this was like, if you keep trying, if you keep, fighting the good fight, you're going to make it, you're going to make it, you're going to make it. So I always had this sort of, again, this optimism or this hope that I was going to change. When I eventually left and went to grad school, I came back to Canada and went to, a university not far from where I'm from. It was there that I started to realize this really didn't work. Because like when you're in the Liberty bubble within sort of like this like sacred canopy on a Christian campus, everyone's again looking in the same direction. You're all doing your best to follow Jesus, whatever. And when you're outside of that, especially in a context where most of your friends or most of your contacts aren't religious, you start to question things in a way that maybe I questioned things before that, because I don't come from a Christian family. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I chose it for myself in high school. And so being in this sort of like the secular world, it was all of a sudden I started seeing the holes in my theory, in my theology. And I started to realize that, in fact, this didn't work. And, again, I met with Pastor Dane. The pastor who my conversion therapist, I fasted for weeks. If we add up the number of weeks I fasted, it would have been months in total. Like I prayed, I read my Bible, I did, everything I could. and clearly didn't work. And so for me, I remember it was one night I was about to go visit my buddy at the pub, and before I was just sort of washing the dishes after dinner, and I was standing under, it was like a split level apartment. My kitchen was in the basement, and there's like this, it was sort of dramatic, I guess, looking back, but like this one light was on sort of over me and dramatic lighting. And I was standing there and I was praying, and I was like, God, what the hell? Like, I have tried and I have tried and I have tried and I've done everything I possibly could to change this. And clearly it hasn't worked. And again, if you're the giver of all good gifts, if you are perfect, and obviously, you want me, according to this, restrictive and restricting theology, to, be straight, and I'm not, it means that you're not the problem. Therefore, who's the problem? It's me. And when you see yourself as a problem, that's of course a problem, right? And so for me, that was the beginning of unraveling how the faith that I had up until that point, because that's when I started, embracing more affirming theology. By the end of grad school, I eventually gave up my faith. I'm no longer a person of faith. But and that was actually had nothing to do with my sexuality. That was more to do with my research in the Holocaust. But at the time, I certainly was invested in by way of a theology, and eventually I became a queer Christian. Again, nowadays, it's just not the conversation that I have with myself, or I don't really, again, I'm not sort of a spiritual person, I suppose, at this point. However, at the time, it certainly was a conversation that I needed to have. And that's why I eventually went to divinity school and sort of started to sort these things out in a more structured manner.
Okay, we're gonna take a turn in this conversation right away, because you said something that I'm like, wait, pause. Your research into the Holocaust is what caused you to lose, or to give up faith, I guess you can say. Give me that story. I mean, why? I'd never heard that one before, so I want to know. Now, obviously, I'm a person of faith. I'm a follower of Jesus, etc. But very big tent, very big room. So there's no judgment here. I'm just so curious what it was about researching one of the greatest human tragedies in human history, that led you to actually leave faith behind completely.
Yeah. And I also should say that regardless of the fact that I'm not a person of faith, I'm still deeply invested in these conversations. I'm deeply invested in these communities, because for a number of reasons, we can get into that later. Anywho, so when it comes to the Holocaust, for me, the question of theodicy, right? Like reconciling a good God with the problem of evil, was really not something that I had thought about in explicit terms for quite some time. And I remember I was, I graduated from divinity school. I took a year off and I taught at this little Christian liberal arts university in Nashville. And then I went and did my PhD down in Florida. My first mistake was going to Florida, but neither here nor there. I love my program.
All is forgiven.
We make decisions and they're not always the best. And so I was in this class, and the class was a class on Elie Wiesel. So Elie Wiesel wrote Night, the Nobel Prize winning author. He's like a prolific author. He died a few years ago. I was actually in Auschwitz, which is where Auschwitz is, when he died. But he, my professor, who eventually became my supervisor, and I was his research assistant, teaching assistant, blah, blah, blah. He had this course on Elie Wiesel. So of course I took it. And it was in there that for the first time, I recognized Jewish protest against God as a common sort of practice. And of course, for us in the Protestant, in Protestant traditions, even though our name's Protestant, we don't protest God. We sort of oftentimes, at least in the more conservative varieties, are very sort of like, we acquiesce and sort of like are deferent to God, and whatever God says, God's ways are higher, et cetera, et cetera. We just sort of like, defer to God. And I saw Elie Wiesel over and over in his writings protesting God. And it wasn't that because Wiesel never gave up his faith. He always remained a person of faith until the day he died. But he did protest and say, God, what I see and what I saw, if we're talking about the Holocaust, or if we're talking about human tragedies afterwards, these are things that you need to, we need to hold you accountable for. And I remember reading this being like, Elie Wiesel, like, who do you think you are talking to God like that, right?
Right.
And of course,
insert that Bible verse from Paul. Who are you, oh man, to talk back to God, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like big old gasps. And so I remember reading this and being like, oh my gosh, like there was this one time he wrote this New York Times op-ed where he says to God, like, God, let's just get to the bottom of what happened. Like, the Holocaust happened. Let's hash this out. Let's finally come to terms, and just sort of like discuss Obviously, God was silent and God didn't respond to Wiesel, and Wiesel kept writing after that. However, for me, reading that, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is such a different model for how I can interact with God. So for me, I started actually questioning a lot of things. And I remember I was sitting one day, I was sitting on my couch, and for when you're reading and for classes, you're reading and then you're on your phone and you're reading on your phone, you get distracted, whatever. And so I'm sitting there and I saw this, I don't remember who it was to this day at this point. So, but nonetheless, I saw this person, she had written something along the lines that she had gotten from someone I follow on my social media, that she had gotten a free Starbucks coffee and that she was blessed. And I remember sitting there and it was just this thing that just like, this was what unraveled everything. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, where I sat there, I thought, wait a second. Homegirl here thinks that she got blessed by God. And of course, blessings from God are active decisions from God for God to give a gift, whatever that gift might be. And then I thought, wait a second. So God gave her a free Starbucks coffee, but then didn't give the free Starbucks coffee to, I don't know, the homeless person or the person experiencing homelessness, just outside of the Starbucks or down the road, whatever. That's also an active decision because God actively chose to give it to her, but not to him or to, whoever else. And I thought, okay, so if that's the case, just following this logic, I just think to myself, why would God act here, here, and here, but not act here, here, and here? And of course, I'm sitting here reading Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel survived the Holocaust. And I thought, okay, well, let's apply this to the Holocaust. Like, why did God, save, quote unquote, some and then not others? And why were some people, unaffected and some people's entire lives were destroyed to the point of literal, like, annihilation and suffering and, beyond? And I started thinking, okay, so if I think that God is good, and at this point I was like, no, that's sort of like a base belief that I have to have is that God is good, because I don't want to believe in a bad God. I said, okay, if God's good, then that means that God doesn't act in the world, because if God acts sometimes but doesn't act other times, therefore we can, like Wiesel, hold God accountable for, again, not doing good things or doing bad things if in fact there are bad things being done. So for me, it was just this idea that, okay, I no longer believe in miracles. I can't believe in miracles, because if I believe in miracles, that means that God is good sometimes and not good other times. And therefore that troubles my very firm belief or desire to believe that God is good.
Yeah.
And then after that, I thought, okay, so if God's not acting, and I just sort of, again, I think there's a God. I don't know who the heck that God is at this point. And to be honest, I don't think that God cares who I am all that much, because God's not really shown much interest in me. I've shown a lot of interest in that God, but God's not sort of reciprocated. So for me at this point, again, I believe that there's some sort of creator. I believe that there's some sort of, design in the world, or in the universe, but I just don't think it's all that personal, at least from what I can find right now.
Well, Luke, everyone on this show must profess Christ as Lord personally. So if you don't do that, I have to end this conversation early, and I can never post it. So.
Oh shoot! I mean, actually, all Kevin, what I just said was a big joke.
Kevin didn't tell you?
Funny joke.
Friends, Kevin Garcia is our connection. That's how Luke got on the podcast. So just some backstory there. Yeah, okay. Gosh, I love this conversation. So let us dive in. It's interesting. I when I was younger, I had no problem with the problem of evil. I'm like, oh, well, God's in control and his ways are not our ways, and it just made sense. And no matter what I think, God is God. And the older I got, the more this really became an issue for me. I'm like, because to your point, and forgive the caricature audience, but the white blonde chick, who got a free latte at Starbucks is like, God blessed me. And then a child somewhere else is starving to death, right? Because of the very capitalism that has produced that latte. And it's like, okay, so yeah, I mean, if God is all powerful and just chooses to bless some over than others, that doesn't sound like a good God. And then of course the other alternate is maybe God isn't all powerful. And honestly, I think that's where I've kind of landed more and more, is more of the Tom. I'm not sure if you know who Tom Oord is, open and relational theologian. He's kind of drawing on open theism, and his idea is that maybe God just can't. Maybe God is powerful, but not all powerful, and he just can't stop evil. And I'm like, this is at least a better answer to the problem of evil than God could, but chooses not to, because especially one modern day example of this, right? And I'm sure you're aware, when Trump's assassination attempt happened, right? And the bullet whizzed past his ear but killed the firefighter. And what's right-wing media doing? Oh, God has his hand on Trump. Yeah, but then God also killed that firefighter. Like, God literally destroyed a family for the sake of Trump? Like the man the man who embodies none of the values that you claim this God actually cares about? Like, the math ain't mathing, right? And so I strongly agree with you. And it's so interesting because for such a long time, I cared so much about theology and getting it quote unquote right. Having the right theology. What is the true gospel? What's the Bible really say? And I think around a campfire, I still really enjoy those conversations. Like they're fun, they're engaging, it's fun to speculate. But my God, like I just realized that it's such a fool's errand to really think that somehow you figured out the nature of God, if they exist or not. And I'm kind of in your camp, even though I'm still very much a Christian and Jesus follower. And I think this might shock some of the audience, but I would agree, Ron. Like I don't really know, and by no I mean like have like 99% confidence in. I don't really know what God is or isn't like. I choose to believe that at the center of the universe is a love that compels all of us, and I choose to believe that Jesus is an embodied form of what God is like. And so my allegiance is to the way of Jesus, loving one's enemy and taking care of the least of these. But I don't know if that's how it all went down. I don't even know if he rose again. I mean, I believe he did, but I don't know if he did. It's kind of a crazy claim. And that's kind of how I've maybe justified keeping my faith and keeping this like thing that has shaped me and that I'm still very much drawn to, like this way of the risen Christ, while also acknowledging that, yeah, the evangelical apologists, the Lee Strobels, the Sean McDowells of the world, I don't really find their arguments super compelling for the level of certainty that they give someone, right? That's my issue. My issue isn't people have beliefs. We all have beliefs that are irrational and make no sense, but they are compelling for us to make sense of the world. But when someone sells it as this is true in the scientific sense, and this is false, but it's theology and it's history, that's when I go, I don't know, guys. Like, I think it's way more mysterious than that, period. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it absolutely makes sense. And I think that at the end of the day, theology is theory, right? Like we're theorizing about God. And when we sort of demystify theology and name it for what it is, which is theory, I think that we're all sort of like, feeling in the dark, trying to figure it the heck out. And I think that the posture that you have, like this epistemic humility where it's like, I just don't know. Like, imagine if the world and like particularly Christians all just said, I just don't know. Like how different this world would be, right?
Yeah.
I think that it's such a posture of, again, it's something that I think would save us a lot of grief if we just were able to say, I don't know. And that's not just in regards to theology. That's in regards to like everything, right? Like for folks who don't understand like what it means to be transgender, like maybe you just don't know, and that's fine, right? Like, and maybe you can ask and you can inquire and you can try to figure it out as best as you can. But at the end of the day, if you just say I don't know, that's a great place to start, because I think that for me, what grad school taught me was how little I know. I now am sort of like, I oftentimes just think when people ask me like, what do you think about this? Half the time I'm like, I have no idea. Like I don't, because I think like, what I've realized is my area of research, again, even within that, I realize over and over and over how little I know, where, I talk with people and like, oh, do you know this person, or do you know this book, or do you know this, whatever like group? And I'm like, nope, I don't. And I think that it's a way of living that I think just allows for, honestly, like community to form much better than when we have community that are based on rigid structures of belief and rigid sort of like requirements for people to believe X, Y, and Z. And if you don't, then you're out. That to me is, again, a very different approach. And I think that the latter, or the former, is much better than the latter.
Yeah, it's a weird paradox, right? Because, for example, I was a drummer for 25 years of my life, and I haven't played in a few months because this job got to be, all-encompassing, and I love it. But the more I played, and ironically, the more proficient I got, the more I realized how little I knew and understood about drumming and music, right? And it's weird because people that maybe aren't as skilled seem to have way more confidence in how much they know, but they're not as good at it, right? I mean, and this is an observation I've seen doing this podcast for 4 years now. I've interviewed fundamentalists. I've interviewed conservative Christian scholars. I've interviewed Sean McDowell on the podcast before. And honestly, I will say, out of all the apologists, I think Sean McDowell is one of the most, at least humble in his approach. I think he's the most good faith. So shout out to Sean for that. But I've also interviewed a lot of scholars. I mean, Dr. Jennifer Bird, Pete Enns, Bart Ehrman. I mean, I've had them on, and I've noticed that academics like that tend to talk way less in absolute terms and more in probability. Well, like there's good evidence that would suggest, in my opinion, based on the research I've seen, this. And that's a very different approach than this is clear, this is right, this is wrong. And it's funny because they actually know more and yet are more uncertain versus people who know less and tend to come across as way more certain around any issue, in particular, culture war issues, especially. That's an interesting paradox that I've noticed as well over the past few years.
Yeah, I just think to myself, like, for me, like, my research at this point is on evangelicals, particularly in the context of higher education, but also in regards to conversion practices and this kind of stuff. And like, there are certain things where, like, yeah, this is like, for instance, conversion therapy doesn't work. We know that. These are things that you can hold on to, but there are so many things that I refuse to claim knowledge about because I just don't know. And I think that you're right. Like, for folks who are like armchair theologians, or those who are, like a church elder with no training, like they have like a business degree and they're like, I know about God. You're like, dear Lord, like, I don't claim anything to know anything about economics, but here you are with, someone who has no training. Like, and even if it's like, I'm not saying that formal training is the be all and end all, but it certainly is something, and it certainly does give you sort of like at least exposure, hopefully, to a multitude of, or sort of like a multiplicity of viewpoints. And I just find it so ironic, and you're absolutely right. Like, you have these people out there who are the people who are most sure are the people who have done the least amount of reading and the least amount of research and had fewer conversations than those, again, who claim to really just not know, or to say, this is my opinion and I'll leave it at opinion, right?
And it seems like in the American context, and I think this is more global as well, there is a global fascist phenomenon happening in Hungary and Italy, etc. But particularly in the U.S., it seems like the people who either know the least or who are willing to lie the most have access to the most amount of power right now. I mean, I think about Trump and some of his comments. I think about the Christian nationalists behind him. I think about folks like Stephen Miller. That whole world, they really are either ignorant or they're just downright lying. And they seem to have convinced a lot of people to vote for them and to support these policies. Now, of course, the data, unsurprisingly, shows that over the past 100 days, right? They always measure the first 100 days in office. Americans overwhelmingly are rejecting Trump's moves, unless you're a white evangelical. 72%, this is Pew Research, as of April, say that Trump is doing a bang-up job in his first 100 days. And of course, white Protestants and Catholics are behind them by a little bit, but still in the majority. And it is interesting to see the fruit of this way of thinking. This, like, and I would love your thoughts because you study this stuff, but in my understanding, like this whole fundamentalist takeover of evangelicalism, because evangelicalism was not always like this. Early evangelicals were abolitionists; they were definitely pious, but like they were justice oriented, right? And there's like this fundamentalist takeover that happens, through a lot of different twists and turns. And now we have this expression of white Christianity that is steeped in white supremacy, and also steeped in biblical literalism. Well, I will backtrack. Scott Coley, a great philosopher, author of the book Ministers of Propaganda, calls it motivated literalism. And his point is that what they do is they only are literal in the Bible when it does not go against their interests, right? And this is how they're able to say Genesis 1 is literal, but Jesus saying it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom than the camel to go through the eye of a needle, that's figurative. Anyway, I say all this because this way of thinking seems to be totally in power right now in America, and there's a right-wing media machine that has convinced millions of people that they are standing on truth and integrity, and the opposite is true. Like, objectively, the opposite is true, right? There are people who still say the election was stolen in 2020, even though we know objectively that did not happen. It is really wild watching fundamentalism and that way of thinking take over America and seeing the results.
It's funny that you're talking about like folks in power. And I think that's the key right there, is the idea of power. I think that, for the research that I do, I focused a lot on Jerry Falwell, the founder of Liberty University. And, with him, like, I make the argument now, and I don't even think it's an original argument. I think that in part, for anyone who watched the documentary about Jerry Falwell Jr. On Hulu, about the pool boy, his wife, and Liberty or whatever, mostly about him and the pool boy, but whatever, and Becky, his wife. For these folks, like, I think an implicit argument within that documentary was, without the evangelicals, without specifically Jerry Falwell Sr., we would not have gotten Trump, right? Jerry Falwell
Yes.
Sr. was certainly not the only sort of bombastic, loud, brash, preacher. There were obviously many before him, but I think the way that he not only was loud and sort of like, again, vocal about all of these quote unquote social, issues, but on top of that, he brought in a few other things that I think really made what we see today, the Republican Party today, which are, media. He was early in his ministry. He got a radio ministry, then he got a TV ministry. From there, once he got into the moral majority, we can see that he started using direct mail, right? And seeing how, he would send out these letters, these like ridiculous inflammatory letters about queers, about, feminists, about whoever, saying, if we don't act now and if you don't give me $25, I won't be able to do the work that I need to do. And so we start seeing that for him, like, again, I do think that he was a person who believed a lot of what he said. I don't know, obviously, the extent of that, but I do think he was quite sincere in what he believed. However, I also see how he understood there to be an opportunity, and it was based on the example of Martin Luther King Jr., which is ironic because Martin Luther King Jr. is a very different, historical figure. But he saw the way that Martin Luther King Jr. was able to mobilize, Black folks within the U.S., and there was some sort of political efficacy by mobilizing and organizing. So he did this within the white Christian nationalist sort of vein of things. And then of course we see other folks come up, Pat Roberts and what am I thinking of? Oral Roberts, Pat Roberts, and whatever. We see like Anita Bryant, all these folks, and Phyllis Schlafly, and well, she's Catholic, but whatever. So you see all these other folks sort of come up as well, and around the same time. And all of them, I think, are realizing that there's so much that they can do with their constituents and their parishioners or their congregants, and how they can mobilize these people ultimately to keep the U.S. the way that they remember it, right? And so they have this sort of nostalgia for like the 1950s and like the 1940s when everything was good and families were whatever, like the nuclear family sort of reigned supreme. And it's like, yeah, it was also a time of like wild racism, a time of wild sexism, misogyny. It was a time where like homophobia, like obviously was a thing, but it was like, it wasn't even on people's radars that people could be gay, right? Like for most people, it was just sort of anathema. It was just like, that's not even a thing. That's not even on people's radars. So I think for them, it was a way of returning the US back to the time that they liked and the imagined time, right? Where they're not talking about a real time in history. They're talking about a time that they sort of romanticized. And they realized that if they mobilize people together, they're going to make America great again, quote unquote, right? Like Jerry Falwell and his cronies were like the precursors to what we see today. And even like the Make America Great Again, like drawing upon Reagan, right? There's all of these connections that I think that it's an effort to drag the US back into an imagined past that never was. And really it's all about power and staying in a privileged position in society and, and just, again, being comfortable. And I think that what we see today is that they don't really care about a lot of these things unless they serve their purposes. And that's why they push a lot of these narratives that are simply untrue, and they don't rely on facts. They instead rely on feelings, which is so ironic that oftentimes evangelicals are the ones saying, like gays, all they do is they focus on their feelings. Women, all they do is they rely on their feelings. And it's like, I'm not saying that we don't, and also women don't, and feminists don't, but I will say that evangelicals are some of the most emotional people I know. You know what I mean? Like, so I think there's so much there, and I think it's really just, we can look at it historically. We can look at it, if we do look at it historically, we can see where this comes from and trace it back to, again, around the 60s, 70s.
100%. And people often think that Jerry Falwell got motivated over abortion. That's not the truth. It was over integration. Jerry Falwell preached a sermon, Brown v. Board of Education, which essentially, he says that if the justices knew God's will, they would never have voted in favor, of Brown. And, it is wild again to think about, because people often think, okay, this Trump is a fluke. He's he came out of nowhere. No. Right-wing evangelicals, since the moral majority, and even I would argue even like R.J. Rushdoony, more of the dominionism, theonomy side in the 60s and 70s, those worlds have given us the fruit of Trump, right? They've given us the fruit of people like who we track on the show, like Stephen Wolfe and other folks who are writing books called The Case for Christian Nationalism, where Stephen Wolfe says on a podcast that he's all for blasphemy laws. He would love to see atheists put in jail in America. These are real things that people want. And again, like what happens is this, right? And this is what drives me crazy, Luke, is that people go, oh, they're just fringe. They're just fringe cuckoos. I'm like, you don't get it. You don't need to be popular to gain power. And the reality is that these folks are 1 to 2 connections away from the White House at this point, because people like Mike Johnson are in power. People don't know. I'm going to rant for a second here, Luke. Don't mind me. But people don't understand that the issue with Pete Hegseth, for example, is not just that he was a drunk or that he's an abuser of women, all bad things, but because the church he went to sits under the teachings of Doug Wilson, a man who defends the Confederacy, a man who wrote a book in 2001 called Southern Slavery as It Was, with a white supremacist arguing for slavery being a time of racial harmony. This is, I mean, there's a real quote in the book about this. Pete Hegseth goes to a church that loves Doug Wilson. He goes to a church who's, they have a podcast called, I think it's called Red Pill Reformation, and they preach this stuff. You know, they preach not just, let's see, Russell Moore, maybe complementarianism, which is whatever, but like, I'm talking far right headship, women under men, children under the family. God has ordained the nation a certain way. I've interviewed Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson wants Jesus Christ as Lord in the Constitution before he dies. This is who Pete Hegseth draws from, right? And the fact that no one on the committee for his nominee or his nomination, no one on that vetting committee, I'm blanking on the term, asked him about his connection to that world of theology scares me, because what it says is that no one really knows what's going on here behind the scenes, right? And that's why we've been so loud for as long as we have, because I think that mainstream media sources, the general public, does not understand the militant theology steeped in white supremacy, steeped in patriarchal norms, heteronormativity, has been it's been brewing behind the scenes for decades. And they want to stay incognito because they know if they were exposed, most Americans would go, "What the hell? Are you guys kidding me?" And so that's what scares me, is seeing that, to your point, this has been in the works for a long time, and they finally have access to the power that they've been seeking, and the result is going to be, I mean, it's already been disastrous. Look at what's happening with immigration right now. It's crazy that we're allowing white, South Africans in under the term refugee, while the Trump administration, and I know this for a fact, by the way, is cutting off refugee programs from organizations like World Relief. I know of a story, this is not been publicized, but I have firsthand accounts. They overnight cut off access to Afghani refugees coming to the U.S. The same Afghans who worked with the U.S. government when they were there in Afghanistan. They cut off access to them coming to the States. They left them, I think it was, they left them in a country. It might have been Iran. I don't think it was. But they left them, they were in limbo. So they were not in Afghanistan. They were in a different country to come over to the U.S. The Trump administration said, "You're not welcome here." They couldn't go back to Afghanistan because the Taliban took over and would literally kill them. And these organizations had like 48 hours to figure out what to do because the nation that they were in was like, "Well, they can't stay here either." Like, this is what we're doing, And at the same time, the Trump administration is like, "Well, if you're from South Africa and you're white, you must be a persecuted class. Come on over." It's crazy, but there is a logic to this.
And you know what? At one point you brought up there was this idea that like we've been talking about this for years, and we have, right? Like this is not new for us. This is something that we sensed. I should speak for myself, but I'm assuming it's also been the case for you. When you were even in the movement, when you were a part, like sort of on that side of the aisle, you sort of sensed like something's wrong here. This doesn't completely make sense. And again, once you sort of like had that critical distance and moved away from it, you're like, oh shoot, like look at how ridiculous these beliefs are. Look at how dangerous these beliefs are. And I find it wild that the mainstream media, and also again, those in power, when they are questioning these folks, they don't bring up religion the way that they need to bring up religion. And I'm not saying that religion is the only reason why these folks are motivated, by no means. However, it is a huge piece of the puzzle that needs to be explored. And again, like there are economic factors, there are international sort of relations factors. Of course, there are a number of different reasons why these people are doing what they're doing, and ways we can understand them and understand their actions through different sort of lenses. But one of the biggest, if not the biggest, is through looking at how these folks are connected to the white Christian nationalist movement and how theology motivates these people. And again, theology, I don't even mean that it's against sincerely held beliefs, but it's at least beliefs that lend themselves really well to these people being in power and maintaining power. And so I think that, again, like when you have articles written in different mainstream media, publications that are saying like, oh, it's white Christian nationalism. It's like, yeah, where have you been, bitch? Like, we've been talking about this for like years. Right. And I think that it's just wild to me that this is sort of like surprising to people. And again, people just haven't listened. I think about like Chrissy Stroop, who's someone who's been, sounding the alarm for years, and people haven't been listening in the way that they need to be listening. Because if they only understood, again, how these folks, approach theology and live out their theology, or don't live out their theology, whatever you want to frame it, if we were to understand this, we would be in a much better position to fight this. And I think it's just this biblical, or sort of like, what's the word, like illiteracy. I don't want to say biblical literacy, because again, it's, I would say more so like white Christian nationalism literacy. If people were to read the room and see what's going on and know, again, what certain things mean and how certain things operate, then I think, again, we'd be in a much better position to fight this.
Yes. I mean, look, Bradley Onishi, Andrew Whitehead, Samuel Perry, Kristen Dumais, Matthew Taylor, Jamar Tisby, Anthea Butler. I mean, I can go on. Jim Wallace. I mean, Reverend Otis Moss III. These people have been sounding the alarm for years. I mean, when I came onto the scene, which was right around January 6th, I discovered their writings from before that, right? They have been sounding the alarm. And there's other ones, too, that go under the radar. Julie Ingersoll, an expert on Christian dominionism. Like all of these folks have been sounding the alarm. And it is wild. I want to play a clip. Do I have it here? Oh, that's the wrong shot. Where is it? Where's my shot? Where is it? There we go. Do you know who this guy is?
Sean!
Sorry, I didn't want to trigger you, but I play this clip semi-often. Listen to this clip of Sean Foy talking. This guy speaks most recently, he was at the White House leading worship with a bunch of far right-wing Christian nationalist pastors. So this guy has major access to the White House. Here's how he sees the world. Let me do this, actually. I gotta change the setting on here. Let me see if I can get it real quick. Where is it? Okay, cool. All right, listen to this.
It's all part of the King coming back. That's what we're practicing for. That's why hell hates it that we're worshiping at every capital across America. That's why we get called, well, you're a Christian nationalist. You want the kingdom to be the government. Yes. You want God to come and overtake the government. Yes. You want Christians to be the only ones that, yes, we do. We wouldn't be a disciple of Jesus if we didn't believe that. We want God to be in control of everything. We want believers to be the ones writing the laws. Yes, guilty as charged. I mean, it's funny when I meet Christians where I'm like, I'm like, have you read the Great Commission? Like, this is actually what we want. Guilty.
It's crazy. I mean, this is what they believe. This is what they believe. Like they believe, Matthew Taylor calls it Christian supremacy. And I love that because it's a little more, I think it's a little more clear in what they actually want, right? They're not looking, and this is all data. You know the data, but just so the audience knows, this is from PRRI, great research firm on this. They, Christian nationalists do not believe in multiculturalism. They don't believe in pluralism. They don't believe in trying to find the common ground. And it drives me bonkers that so many mainstream, even left-wing people don't understand that. One of my biggest gripes, now I'm really going to ramp, I'll be succinct here, is watching. Please. So I go to America Fest every year. It's hosted by Turning Point USA. It's Charlie Kirk's organization. I go every year. Yeah, every year. I've been there 3 years in a row, and I go to understand it. I do a big piece on YouTube about it. People can go back and find it and hear my most recent recap. And it's a 20,000 plus people, man. It is the Super Bowl of Christian nationalism, in my opinion. Lance Wallnow spoke last time. Like, there's a lot of heavy hitters. And, I've developed connections with most of them. We talk cordially offline, and that kind of keeps me in to understand what's going on behind the scenes. And when I was there last year, Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks showed up, and he went on stage to talk to Charlie. I'm like, oh, I got to see this because, Cenk, this like bastion of left-wing progressive ideology certainly is going to challenge Charlie on his own turf to have a conversation. And like Cenk just gave this dude, like, he just tried to shake hands the whole time, tried to find the common ground. And here's the thing. I am not opposed, of course, to having conversations with folks that you don't agree with. I mean, I think that's really important if you're going to hold their feet to the fire. And watching Cenk just largely capitulate and talk about, well, we agree on this, we agree on that. I'm like, you don't understand. For Charlie, this is almost like a holy war, and you are the enemy. And he doesn't want to shake your hand. He doesn't want to find common ground. He wants to dominate. He wants to take over. And my concern is that with some people in these more like I don't know, like Democratic spaces, like Gavin Newsom, same thing. You know, he has Charlie on the show, challenges none of his of his points that are total BS, and just tries to shake his hand. I'm like, what are you doing? Have you not heard, you know, what Charlie wants to do? The people he platforms. That's my concern. Is like I don't really see a viable left-wing option with real teeth attached to it and funding and visibility that can really combat this right now.
You know what? Connecting both the Sean and then the Charlie. So with Sean, like hearing him talk about like how they would go to the state capital, or they're going to these state capitals. First of all, Jerry Falwell, if we were to bring it back historically and think about the sort of like the historical antecedents, Jerry Falwell had what were called I Love America rallies. And I wanted to like show you a picture, but I have no way of doing that right now. So instead, for anyone who's listening, literally go to type in I Love America rally and then Google Images it. And it's terrifying. Like you see, it's just like, if you go to the image tab.
Let's see. Like this?
There it is, right? And it's just all of these, like, this is what Jerry Falwell will do. And like, if you look at all of like the photos, it's really just like all these American flags, everyone dressed in red, white, and blue, Jerry Falwell going to these state capitals and protesting. And oftentimes what he would say was that he was protesting, you know, gays, lesbians, and Nazis. And of course, when you put those three groups together, it makes it sound like they're all on par with each other. And of course, you know, a way of demonizing everyone. And Sean, of course, demonizing everyone the way that he does. And so seeing that, like this effort to, again, like I think Falwell wasn't necessary. He would oftentimes say, like, I'm not looking for a theocracy. I'm not looking for a theocracy. But and then would say, we need Christian leaders. We need people in politics. We need people in media. We need people here, here, and here. And I think that he laid the groundwork for Sean, right? And for people like, you know, like him and his cronies who are doing this work now, it wouldn't be possible without these folks. But then I think about Charlie Kirk, another friend of Liberty University, right? There was even the Falkirk Center with Jerry Jr., this like evangelical think tank, which is of course a contradiction in terms. But nonetheless, right, these people who are out here again, and this idea of sort of trying to shake their hand, right? And sort of like placate and sort of, you know, just sort of like be cordial. I think that if anything, we were taught anything during the last U.S. election, I think it's to like point out the ridiculousness and really call it for what it is and not pull any punches, right? It's very like Michelle Obama in the first election with Trump was, you know, when they go low, we go high. The second time, it wasn't that ethic. And I think it was much more of a disruptive ethic. And I think nowadays we need to be, again, not sort of like just like lay over and die, you know, on the side of the road when these people are walking by, but instead we need to be incredibly intentional with how we address like the misinformation, the disinformation, and again, like how these people are going out there and mobilizing people. I think we need to be in the same way fighting in a really sort of like energetic and excited way, because if we don't, well, there goes democracy. And again, right now, arguably democracy is already at the beginning of the end in the US specifically. And let's just hope to God that people start mobilizing and working against this. And again, really recognizing the white Christian nationalist undercurrent and overcurrent that we see today.
It's funny, you know, I was always taught to care about objective truth and objective morality, and these are the folks who are the subjective relativists. You know, like I think about how I was taught. I know you were too. We just talked about it earlier about sexual purity and sexual design and God's order and how important that was. And these are not matters of opinion; these are objective facts of the universe. And the second Trump comes on the scene, Jerry Falwell Jr., well, you know, that's just locker room talk. Well, we need a commander-in-chief, not a pastor-in-chief. You know, all of a sudden, after these horrible, you know, leaked Hollywood access tapes come out, and also we see that Trump's on the cover of Playboy, and he's on his third marriage. Again, all the things as a straight white man. I mean, I read Wild at Heart, bro, okay? I know what I was called to be as a man. I had to storm the castle and fight for the beauty and rescue her and live a life of integrity. And Trump comes along, and he's literally the epitome of everything I was taught never to be as a man. Everything. He's greedy. He lies. He's a fornicator. He's sexually promiscuous, etc. And they go, how dare you not vote for that guy? I was like, you know, I'm sorry. Who's the one moving the goalposts? Who's the one who's actually capitulating to this idea of moral relativism when you literally had people recreate new theologies to justify why Trump was the dude we all had to vote for? That was the moment. I mean, there were a lot of problems I had, a lot of questions I had way before all that. But that was the moment for me where the dam, it just broke wide open. Like, excuse me? Like, I saved myself technically for marriage. Like technically I did it. And you're telling me that because I'm not moving on this, I'm the one who's crazy? Like, do you hear yourself? And of course, that was only the beginning. One insurrection later and, a second turn later, that's a complete disaster already. And it's like, wow, you guys were really wrong on this, but they're too arrogant and too prideful to admit their mistakes, which is, again, so ironic because on Sunday mornings, they will talk about their humility before God and their repentant attitude. And, it doesn't make, in a way it makes sense, but in another way, it's like so full of contradictions, right? Like, how do you worship Jesus on Sunday, sing songs about his reckless love and his great love for all of us, and then go, man, Trump is really doing the thing for us as he deports people as young as 2 years old? Like, what the hell? Oh my God, it's enraging.
The way that I've started to think about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is that I think about it in terms of projection, right? They're the moral relativists. They're like the ones who are out there, grooming children and molesting children. And then it's like every single accusation is a confession, I'm finding, right? That so often it's like they're this, they're this, they're this, and they're this. And then you look and it's like, if you just look in the mirror, if you look to the side, if you look on their side, everything that they're saying is a way of like creating a shitstorm so that you don't see what they're doing, which is precisely what they're accusing people of. And so I think to myself so often now, when I think about it in those terms, it makes so much more sense where they're like, oh, they're this, and they're this, because they don't want people to look at them. And if they do really quickly, again, like if you look at folks out there who are, convicted of whatever, like porn or child porn or molestation or whatever, we don't see drag queens. We don't see trans people. We see pastors. We see youth pastors. We see youth workers. We see like youth leaders, whatever, in churches. We see, police chiefs. We see all these folks. We don't see the folks that they're accusing of doing these like heinous things. It's them. And so for me, that's the way I just started to think about it. And again, that theory sort of has limits, but by and large, I think it applies and maps onto reality the way that I've seen it. What do you think?
I completely agree. I mean, more and more, I'm like, wow, every accusation really is a confession. Right. And look, that's not to say no matter what group you fall in when it comes to humanity, right, whether you're straight, gay, whatever, doesn't matter. People could do bad things. People do bad things all the time. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Black, white, it doesn't matter. We all can do bad things. So no one is suggesting that, one group is totally bankrupt and one group is totally perfect. Right. The problem is this goes back to the lack of nuance and really also data. Data shows that your child is like 95% more likely to be groomed and assaulted at church than they are at drag queen story hour, right? I mean, I would even say 99%, because like it's a public setting, right? However, for that world, what they'll do is they will find maybe one example of a person who dressed in drag who also had child abuse material on their computer and go, look, this is the proof. They are all groomers. And then they will look at the nonstop torrent of story after story of pastor after pastor doing horrible things to children and go, it's not really a problem. It's not a problem. Everything's fine. It's like, guys, like, what are you doing, right? And it's the same thing with immigration. Laken Riley, the tragic story of she was murdered brutally by a person who was undocumented in the country. She became, for the right, the reason why all immigrants are criminals, right? They take one example or one story that, again, is tragic. There's truth to that. That was bad. That was wrong. And they go, look, therefore, they're criminals. When the data shows that you are twice as likely to have a crime committed against you by a native-born citizen than you are an undocumented immigrant, right? So statistically, a white man is way more dangerous than an undocumented immigrant. But because of their narrative, you would think that a brown-skinned immigrant is way more dangerous than a white man. Why? Because they have an agenda, right? And ultimately, the agenda comes back down to maintaining a certain type of America that is very straight, very white, and very patriarchal. And yeah, I agree with you. I mean, even Matt Gaetz has credible accusations from a House committee of him sex trafficking and sleeping with assaulting a minor. That man speaks at churches with Charlie Kirk. Guys, what are you doing? What happened to flee from the appearance of evil? Even if Matt was innocent, which I don't think he is, doesn't it look kind of wonky to have a man with these accusations against him, who, by the way, a House committee found to be credible, speak at your church with Charlie Kirk as you talk about the problem of groomers? Are you joking? So I agree with you, Luke. Like, I think more and more as I see these examples, I'm like, yep, every accusation is a confession. It just is, and it's infuriating to watch.
It's crazy for a group that's so obsessed with optics, right? Trying to look a certain way, that there's such like wild blind spots. And I don't, again, maybe not, I should say they're not blind spots. Like they're cognizant of the fact that, again, like the data shows that they're in the wrong. But truth doesn't matter. Facts don't matter. And, I think when I was at Liberty, I remember they used to always talk about how, like, in post-structuralist and like post-modern sort of thinking, that people are no longer invested in questions of truth. And I think that with the rise of Trump, I think that for some people that this idea of like, postmodernism, there not being such thing as truth, I guess there were some people out there, but really, like, this is nowadays we're seeing like the problems with, it's not the postmodernists, it's not the post-structuralists who are the problem, it's them, right? Like they're the ones. Right. And again, it just goes back to this idea of projection, that they're not actually invested in questions of truth. They're not invested in questions of facts or facticity, right? They're looking for an appearance, they're looking for a narrative. And as long as that fits that narrative, even though that narrative is contradictory to, again, their foundational values, that doesn't matter. As long as it looks like they're following the script that they are peddling, that's all that matters. And it's bad shit.
Let me ask you a question, honestly, because you're someone who studied the Holocaust, and I'm sure that means that you studied what led up to the Holocaust, And look, I try and be as reasonable as possible on this show. I'm not here to call everyone a Nazi or everyone a fascist. I get that it's a spectrum, it's complicated, it's not the same thing necessarily, but I notice that there are similar ingredients that I'm noticing, that kind of went into what birthed the Holocaust and what birthed that ideology and what's happening today. And I'm kind of curious from your vantage point, do you see a lot of the same ingredients being used here to scapegoat certain people type or people groups that you think could lead to more and more violence? Do you think that the comparisons of what happened in Germany to today are just kind of overblown and, kind of exaggerated? What's your take on that as someone who studied this stuff?
Right. So first of all, the way that I always start my Holocaust courses whenever I teach, about the history of the Holocaust is we start with the Gospels. We start with the Gospels. We start with early church fathers, right? We start with Christian scriptures and Christian theology. And the reason we do that is because ultimately the argument that is, again, it's not exclusive to me. It's not original to me, I should say, is that without Christian scriptures, without Christian theology, the Holocaust would never have happened the way that it did. And so, if we're thinking about different stereotypes against Jews specifically, so many of those find their genesis in the Christian scriptures and then also early church fathers who mobilized those teachings, which have ultimately led up to a lot of the ways that Jews were understood in, 1933 when Hitler rises to power. And of course, he's, in Mein Kampf, when he's in jail and he's writing about these things, he's, drawing upon these arguments that have been, again, in circulation for centuries and centuries and centuries. So I think first and foremost, when we think about the Christian connection to the Holocaust and then laying the seedbed for the Holocaust, and then we think about white Christian nationalism, of course, we see a connection there. I think also when we're thinking about the anatomy of hatred, like what are different components of what allows us to treat certain people groups, and it's groups, it's never one group in isolation, but certain people groups, of course, during the Holocaust, we're talking about Jews, and then there were a number of other groups that were also targeted. And today we're thinking about a number of groups, it's not just one. What allows these folks to treat them the way that, they're treated? And of course, first we have to start with symbolic exclusion in order to get to social exclusion. Symbolic exclusion is really just using language to distance us from, other groups. So we're using symbols, letters, words that allow us to treat them as less than human, right? So during the Holocaust, we think of, vermin. We think about, these are pests, these are whatever. And then, thinking about today, how immigrants are understood, how queers are understood, that they're just animals, they're just beasts, right? Like they're just acting like animals. Look at those disgusting people doing this, this, and this. They're lecherous. They're out there, trying to have sex with our white women and desecrate the marriage bond ultimately, because if a woman has sex before marriage or during marriage with someone who's outside of her marriage, covenant, then that's also desecrating the marriage bed, right? And so we see that during the Holocaust. We see that during, really think about any sort of like understanding of a minority group in any period of time that was, pejorative. Think about, Black folks during, like 1920s. These people were seen as lecherous as well, that they were, out to get the white woman and this kind of stuff. So I think that what we find is that we see the symbolic exclusion that's happening and laying the foundation for what we're seeing in regards to social exclusion. In the context of like currently, what is it, May 14th, today, we're thinking about forced deportations. We're talking about abductions. We're talking about a number of different things like this, these are forms of social exclusion. They're breaking up families, they're breaking up communities, and they're doing it very intentionally, right? It's using fear and terror, right, to rule the masses. And, I think that there's so many like connections between ICE and the Gestapo, if I want to be, completely honest, right? I'm not saying that right now we're experiencing another Holocaust per se, but history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And so what I'm seeing today, if I am to be some sort of, sort of like thinking about what could happen, and again, I don't think anyone in, history or literature can sort of predict the future, but if we are to say what we see happening, and if there have been historical sort of precedents set, yes, what we see during the 1930s, specifically in Nazi Germany, we're seeing a lot of rhyming that's going on in the US today.
I mean, it also scares me because I've seen quite a rise in anti-Semitism in the right. I've been on X for a while. When I used to post, it was one kind of hatred. Now I get, oh, your nose looks a certain way. Oh, okay, you must be Jewish. And I'm like, why would that matter? And it seems like it's kind of gaining steam. Then you also have, I'm not sure how much you follow this stuff. Maybe I just am a glutton for punishment, but I watched Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro and how that all went down, and I've seen a rise in people like Candace and others. I mean, Jake Shields, a former UFC fighter, literally they're embodying like Nazi talking points about like World War II, and if Churchill maybe he wasn't the good guy, and the biggest group of people who were decimated were actually Catholics, etc. And I'm like, like this comes from somewhere, and I think it's really concerning to see people like that pushing these talking points and then people defending it under the term free speech. I'm like, well, I understand that you can say whatever you want in America, to a point, but when it comes to what you're espousing on these social media platforms, it seems like free speech is more of a shield of you can't critique me and you can't call me out for the bullshit I'm espousing. And again, like I think one of the things I've realized, and again, I would love your thoughts on this, is that I've been around now in this space for 4 years. I remember when names like the Proud Boys were seen as like, oh, the Proud Boys, like who would ever, tolerate that? Or Nick Fuentes. I mean, whoa, Nick, that guy is crazy. Knowing that he got dinner with our current president, along with Ye and I think Milo Yiannopoulos, and that it was defended a few years ago. The fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene spoke out at his event 2.5 years ago, right, and is still in Congress, that feels like the temperature is slowly rising, and the frogs can't tell when it's about to be boiled alive. But it seems like we're on that path where it's getting more and more extreme, and we're tolerating it because, oh, that's just Trump. Oh, well, that's just how it goes. The last Republican nominee before Trump was Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney. That man is called a rhino and is kicked out of the party now, and Charlie Kirk and his crew are running the RNC, So I'm just curious for you, like, do you see the same thing that I am, where it's like, it seems like we're just trying to normalize more and more extreme behavior that will eventually give birth to violence and, serious harm towards our neighbors?
One thing that I think about is, what was it, Steve Bannon, who said that, if you just keep throwing shit at people and just like making a new sort of like, again, shitstorm every single day, that eventually people are just like sort of like exhausted, and there's just too much that they can't even focus on one thing. And it's ironically happening at the same time that things are slowly rising, right? Like there is this slow rise, while at the same time this like rapid rise. And I don't know how to sort of like conceptualize that or reconcile those two things, but we do see this like crazy amount of ridiculousness and hatred that is again sort of expressing itself daily. And I think that it's both slow and fast at the same time. And again, maybe down the road, we're going to have some, political scientist who's going to be able to understand this in a better way that we can right now. But absolutely. But one thing that I think about, and I want to return to what you were saying, this idea of like the rise of anti-Semitism, it's absolutely bonkers. And I think this is obviously a qualitative difference than what we were talking about before, sort of historical references to Jewish persecution, is that today we have both this wild anti-Semitism that's paired with this wild philo-Semitism, which is love of Jews, and it's particularly directed at those in Israel. And
Right.
So you have this defense of Israel, this like really sort of like wholehearted, like enthusiastic defense of Israel, while at the same time accusing Jews. And of course, Jews are understood like as globalists, right? And anytime we
Yes.
hear the word globalist, know who we're talking about.
Or
This
the
is always
banks.
a term.
Or the banks.
which, if we want to go back to what we were talking about before, like the Christian New Testament, offering itself or lending itself really well to hatred of Jews, we're talking about Judas being the purse holder, right? That this is where that actually is traced back to. That Jews are money hungry. Why? Because Judas. Meanwhile, Jesus was Jewish, and so were the other disciples. Anyway, putting that aside, we're not looking for consistency. We're just looking for the hatred that is. And so I think that what we're talking about when we're talking about, this like philo-Semitism, again, specifically directed at Israel, and then also this anti-Semitism and, again, crazy misinformation and also invocation of Holocaust imagery during, let's say, COVID, right? That it's like we're being sent on trains, right? And so you see this crazy, again, both like drawing upon Jewish imagery specifically or iconography, and then also this enthusiastic repudiation of Jews and hatred of Jews. I think that what we see is really that that philo-Semitism it's like an inch away of anti-Semitism. If Jews don't do what Christians want, and if they don't act according to their theological imagination, an emphasis on imagination, that they say like, we love Jews in a very like abstract way. Ask any of them if they know Jews. They don't know a single gosh darn Jew. They know who they know, quote unquote, are these, again, theological sort of like characters that are part of God's unfolding drama. In order for Jesus to come back, all Jews need to be in Israel, right? They need to be gathered where they will be, and a remnant will be saved. They draw upon this, and this is super important to their theology because, again, it's sort of like what's ushering in the eschaton. It's what's bringing in sort of the end days. And if they don't, have like all the pieces together, well, then Jesus won't come back. So really, they're not talking about Jews they love. They're not talking about Israel as if it's like people they know. They don't know one Israeli. Instead, it's this theological fiction that they're drawing upon, and this necessity to have all Jews in a certain physical geographic place. And so what we see is that if Jews just go there, cool, but otherwise they have lasers on their heads and they're in space, or they're globalists and they're controlling the banks in Hollywood, right? This is sort of what we see with philo-Semitism. It's such a thinly veiled, or it's like an inch away from hatred, because again, they're not talking about real people. They're talking about fictions, and when the fictions don't live up to the reality that they want to see, well, then they're pissed, and they're going to start using a lot of accusations that we've seen in the past.
That is so helpful because, and by the way, friends, I recommend the book, A Short History of Christian Zionism by Donald Lewis. He tragically passed away before I could interview him, but his book is a great primer of kind of how Christian Zionism took root and how that started. But yes, that's so helpful. I mean, I did pull up, speaking of Marjorie Taylor Greene comparing herself and other people to being treated like, Jewish people during the Nazi regime. She tweeted in, I think, March of 2021, vaccinated employees get a vaccination logo, just like the Nazis forced Jewish people to wear a gold star. It's like, and by the way, she's still in Congress. This is a federal lawmaker, right? And you're right. One of the things that I've realized over time, and being able to interview such amazing people, is that Christian Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic, because most of them believe that only a select few Jews will convert and go to heaven, and the rest are going to burn in hell. Like they want the end times to be ushered in, so a lot of Jewish people die, right? It's not a pro-Jewish ideology at all. And of course, as the nation state of Israel commits genocide against the Palestinian people, that is looked over. And yet the same regime says, well, actually, white people in South Africa are facing a genocide. Not true, by the way, at all. So let's bring them over to America. Like, the racism is just so overt, right? It's so clear what they're doing. But I appreciate you kind of helping me and the audience understand that both and, because I have recognized that. I'm like, wait, they hate Jews, but also they love Jews, but also like, Jews are controlling the world. And we all, of course, George Soros, like maybe the chief most hated Jew in the world by the right. George Soros is destroying America, but also we love Israel and we love the Jewish people. Like, wait, how does this work? So that's really helpful to understand because, I mean, yikes, it's just, I don't know. I mean, again, I'm not educated like you are. I have some college under my belt from a small private Christian school, but the more I've done this, the more I'm like, there's a lot of rhyming from what I've heard, about early history, 20th century history, World War I, World War II, how people saw Jewish people, the language. I mean, wasn't it Trump who said something to the effect that, immigrants are poisoning the blood of society, which is, directly almost word for word what Hitler said about Jewish people. Like, when you hear those rhymes and you go, hello, is anyone aware of this? And to see white Christians, the group that raised me, the people that radicalized me to be this Jesus follower, be like, he didn't really mean it. I'm like, what do you mean he didn't mean it? He said it. Like, it's right in front of you. And perhaps that's the most frustrating thing, and also the most difficult thing for me to reason with, right? I try to be data focused. I try and do my work as data focused as possible. What's the research say? What's the science say? What are people actually saying? And it seems like no matter how much evidence I bring certain people, it's like, nah. I mean, I'll never forget, and I'll get your response to this. I was on someone's podcast a while ago. It was an old church person, someone much older than me, but he found me online, and I went on his podcast. It's like one of these apologetic, type. And he's asked me about what it means to be a Christian, and somehow we got into the election. And I go, well, let me ask you a question, so-and-so. Do you think that like the 2020 election was fraudulent or stolen? Oh, absolutely. I'm like, wait, how can we have a conversation about theology and the true gospel and the Bible when we can't agree on objective reality now? And I've noticed this pattern of like, they're so obsessed with truth, biblical truth, knowing the true gospel, what the crucifixion did. But then they're like, well, the election also was stolen, and I'm going to defend this because I'm right. And I'm like, dude. And then no matter what I offered to this person, I was like, okay, let's go through the court cases. Every single court case besides one was overturned, and the other one wasn't even about election fraud. Rudy Giuliani said in court, they're not arguing that the election was stolen. Trump's own Supreme Court said the election wasn't stolen. Can you tell me why you think it was stolen? And then they rattle off some, crazy story that we know has already been debunked. Well, the Georgia officials were counting past midnight, whatever. And that's what gets me. Is I'm like, I thought truth mattered. Like, I thought data mattered. I thought evidence matters. And for this world that taught me that, they're sometimes the first people to ignore it in favor of some kind of dogmatic position. That part, I'm still trying to solve that Rubik's Cube, to be honest with you.
First of all, I want to know really quickly, what school did you go to? Which Christian school?
It was a tiny school. At the time, it was called Somerset Christian. It was in New Jersey. Now it's called Pillar Academy or something. I did like a year and a half there.
Okay, I'm always curious. That's a conversation for later. Anywho, so no, I remember I've told you about my PhD supervisor before, and he and I was in another one of his classes actually. It was called Interfaith Trialogue. So it was conversations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And we were talking all about, Muslims and Jews and Catholics, and also mainline Protestants. And I'm sitting there thinking, as the former evangelical that I was like, right. What about evangelicals? Right. And so weeks are going on in the course, and we're, the semester would have been 12? U.S. semesters are 16 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever. It doesn't matter.
Don't ask me.
I forget. Isn't that terrible? Jeez Louise. 12 or 16 weeks. Let's say 16 weeks just to be conservative, because you and I are quite conservative. Anywho, so, so I finally, one day we were walking, I don't know where we were walking, and I said to him, just outside of the building that we had our office in, and I said, Dr. Berger, what about evangelicals? And he goes, what about evangelicals? And I said, we've talked about mainline Protestants, we've talked about Catholics, we've talked about, Jews and Muslims. I said, but we've not talked about evangelicals. How are we supposed to have a trialogue or a dialogue or a conversation with these folks? He says, you're not. And I was like, excuse me? And he's like, no, you're not going to have a conversation with them. And I said, yeah, but we have to, if we want to have any sort of like way forward looking at, and then this was in 2016, 2017. This would have been 2017, I guess. I said, we need to have some sort of conversation. Otherwise, look at the way things are going. Look at, who just was elected, blah, blah, blah. And he said, yeah, Luke, but it's not going to happen. You will not have a conversation with these folks. And I remember being like, that's like the most unsatisfying answer ever, because if for me, I want to find a way to actually engage these people. I don't want to, just say like, well, here are these people, I'm going to wash my hands to them. I want to be like you, where you're going to these conferences, you're actually engaging with these people and having FaceTime with these people. I want the same thing. And he said, well, you're just not going to find it. So sorry to like disappoint you. And I remember that pissed me off, because I was like, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. But the more I think about it, the more I unfortunately think he's right. The only thing is sort of like the wedge or like what disrupts this narrative for me is like, but what about me? Like I was,
Yes.
in it to win it. Like I was
Yep.
on that side, and like I, 100% was like invested in, and I was like a zealot for Jesus. And I was like, okay, so what about me is different? Obviously, you're similar, and I think there are a number of other folks who are similar. And I think you are more of an exception. I think because you're a straight white man. I think for anyone who's a person of color, for anyone who's a woman, for anyone who is trans or queer or whatever, in some way, shape, or form, that their social location, their identity, their subjectivity is different, that for a lot of people is like the crack in the facade that you start to like sort of like peel away and poke at, that ultimately gives you that sort of exit from that world. For you, I'm actually more like fascinated with you than most people, because again, you don't fit that mold. Like you don't have that point of difference in a perhaps like identity or subjectivity sort of based way that a lot of other folks do. For me, it was that I was queer, and I was like, okay, but I can't subscribe to the sort of heteronormative, marriage arrangement that's expected of me. Like it's just not going to happen. And that was, again, what allowed me to sort of like not exit from the faith tradition. Ultimately, it was, again, like I said, it was the Holocaust, but it was certainly a wedge in the binary understanding of the world that I was like, evangelicalism is resistant to difference. It's resistant to diversity. It's resistant to otherness. And that allowed me to start sort of like untethering myself from this religious tradition in the beginning steps. For you, though, I'm like, how the hell did you come to this conclusion? Like, what would you say like was for you like the exit out? Like, what brought you to where you are now, theologically?
Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, I guess some of the highlights. I have a really complicated and wide experience in evangelicalism. I started off I was homeschooled for 9 years, and my parents were part of like it was an independent fundamental Baptist, but it was a non-denominational Baptist church, so more conservative, in New Jersey, by the way, always in New Jersey. So I kind of had that vibe. Then I encountered John MacArthur and Calvinism, and then I worked for a large organization called Child Evangelism Fellowship. They're one of the biggest like organizations reaching boys and girls with the gospel. So I was like part of like that evangelical counterculture, teenage angst, scene of like I had the Rock for Life shirt that said abortion is homicide on the front. I listened to all the hardcore bands like Emery and Under Oath and the Classic Crime, bands like The Wedding. If anyone out there knows The Wedding, high five. I was also a drummer. I say all that because I had a wide experience. I've planted churches with the Christian Missionary Alliance. I was part of the Assemblies of God for a while. I grew up, like I said, more cessationist, etc. I think that, and everyone's wired differently. And I think the biggest thing that brought me out was curiosity. I was always kind of thinking about things, and I mean, like, for example, it was more the death by 1,000 paper cuts than it was like one moment. I mean, Trump was, I think, the biggest singular moment, like that endorsement. But I remember being, 17, listening to Rush Limbaugh. I was working with my dad in construction, and he was on the radio. And this was like, 6 years into Obama's presidency, and Rush is telling us how terrible America is and how he's destroying the country. And I had this moment where I'm like, but we're all still here. Like America's still going though, like it can't be that bad. Like, is this guy only doing bad things? Because if he was, I would imagine the country really wouldn't be here the way that they say it wouldn't be here. But my dad's working, I'm taken care of, like the world's still operating. He can't only be doing bad things. Now, I didn't have anything to replace it with, but I would go, interesting, and keep, rolling the wall or painting the trim, whatever it was. So I always had those kinds of questions. And as I got older and thought about Calvinism and this idea that God predetermined some people to be the elect and the rest to go to hell, I'm like, I don't know. But of course, the Bible verses, right? Romans 9, who are you, oh man? And so I was just always curious, though, always kind of reading widely. I would read Rob Bell, then I would listen to a guy named Paul Washer, who's like super right of John MacArthur. Then I'm, discovering Brian McLaren, but I'm also reading Francis Chan. And I think experience and also meeting people who were Christians who really loved people well, even though we were conservative, was part of that. I'll tell you two quick things, and this is now turning into my story, but I'll be succinct here. Two things really changed how I viewed the church. One was I read a book by a guy named Frank Viola called Pagan Christianity. His thesis is that most of our church practices today come from pagan culture, not actually from the New Testament. And I was a big New Testament guy, the Acts Church model community, But I'm also 19 or 20 reading this, and I met a bunch of people who were my age who wanted to practice like a life togetherness of community. And we formed this like independent, it wasn't a church, it was just a small group of like 40 people. And we really did life together, like for real. It wasn't, I don't use that term in the typical evangelical small group sense. Like we were fully enmeshed with each other every day doing different things, some spiritual, but some just being friends, and having our little inside group rituals, etc. And it blew my mind of like what's possible to live in community. And so I always was critiquing megachurch culture and the show, even when I was still conservative. And I think the other thing that really changed me was I realized that evangelicals really hated gay people, and I couldn't understand why. Now, I was not affirming. I thought the Bible was clear, but I thought it was like any other sin. Look, Paul talks about how the greedy won't inherit the kingdom either. Why don't we have, greed tests at church? Why don't pastors ask people how they're spending their money every week, since we're so concerned about them sinning? And I had, I met my first ever gay person, and I have permission to tell this story. Him and I still talk. And at Starbucks, I was 18. And his nickname was Joey, and he was gay. I'm like, oh my God, he's gay. Like, my parents have warned me. Stay calm. It's like The Office with Dwight. Stay calm. I've trained for this kind of moment. Like, okay, I can do this. And we met, and we started talking, and I found out that he was an atheist. So I'm like, oh shit. Oh crap. He's an atheist and he's gay. Like, there's no coming back from this, But we started talking, and I over time I'm like, this is a normal human being. Like, he's not trying to sleep with me. He's not crazy. He's not promiscuous. Like, it's laughable now. That's just what I was taught. That they're just hyper promiscuous and they want to sleep with anyone that they can. He was volunteering in his community. I'm like, this guy is actually more immoral than some of my church friends. And a couple of years later, after we both left Starbucks, we kept in touch, and he told me a story that when he was 13. He came out to his youth pastor saying that he was struggling with his sexuality, and his youth pastor called him an abomination and told him never to come back. And that story really broke me. I mean, I cried when he told me that. I mean, it was over instant messenger, and I was crying. My keyboard was wet with tears. I just couldn't imagine an experience like that, because the church I experienced was loving and was home for me. So I think I just always had these questions of like, things aren't fully adding up. And also I want to understand the Bible more deeply. So I discovered the Bible Project, and that led me to Pete Enns. I'm like, whoa, the Bible's way more complicated than I was taught. I've always been a curious person. I think that's what led me out of it ultimately. I wanted truth. It's funny because I tell people I'm just doing what my evangelical tradition told me to do. Care about truth, care about other people, care about God, care about being moral. Yes, which is why I left that world of white evangelicalism behind, and I'm still committed to this Jesus thing. That's the short story.
You know what? I find, first of all, like, wildly admirable and like super cool, because I think that I find like today, to make like a sweeping generalization of like people today, like, but I do find it like quite commonly is like a lack of curiosity. Is like, yeah. I think like, and what is it? Camus talks about, like, Albert Camus like talks about like the lack of imagination, which I think is really a sort of saying the same thing in some senses. Like, if only we had more imagination or more curiosity, however you want to frame it, I think that the world would be such a different place, right? If only we could communicate that, imagination and communicate that curiosity, and then also to have that curiosity or have that imagination, I feel like the world would be a wildly different place. And I think that's like so darn cool, because again, there really wasn't, from what I'm hearing, again, tell me if I'm wrong, there wasn't like a necessity for you to change your views. It just was that's where the evidence brought you. And like,
yes,
if that's the case, then hell yeah.
Yes, exactly. And also, like, I wanted to love people. Like, I don't understand this, Yeah, it's wild. But I want to pick up on one thread. Then, I mean, you've been here for a long time. So, by the way, thanks for spending extra time with me. Usually I just go an hour, but this has been such a great conversation. And audience, I know I'm talking a lot more than usual, but this is conversational. I'm really enjoying it. So let me keep cooking. You made a really astute point that I've also realized, where I understand now why a lot of academics don't do these debates online with evangelical fundamentalists, right? I get it. I used to not. I'm like, oh, just talk to them. Like, just have the conversation. I get it now. And also, because I've changed, I'm like, I can't give up completely on compelling people to think differently who grew up like how I grew up, right? At the same time, I think that some of these like apologists and leaders, they have a presupposition that they are right, and that they have, and that all they have to do is defend. Like, they're not curious, right? Or if they're curious, it's only up to a certain point. And I understand why a lot of people who do this work at the level that you do it don't I hate to say it, but like waste your time on these debates that aren't going to be compelling to anyone. Like they're not going to compel the person you're talking to reconsider their positions when you give them data, because they're already stuck with this position that I have the truth about God and the Bible, and God's way is not our way. So I'm with you. Like I go in between though, because I changed, you changed, other people changed, but I don't think some of these like leaders are ever going to change, and that's frustrating.
Mm-hmm. So I think about a few things. One, I mean, I think about how I became a Christian in the first place. And the reason why I ever became a Christian was actually through like the creation versus evolution debate. Back when that was like a thing, or maybe it still is. I don't know. I guess Ken Ham's still around. But I was big into Ken. He is, God damn it.
$40 million a year in funding. $40 million. Yeah. Yep.
Oh boy. Maybe we'll come back and talk about that another time. But for me, it wasn't even Ken Ham. It was Dr. Dino, who's Kent Hovind from Pensacola, Florida. He used to do these like debates with these different like biologists or geologists or whatever. And he had a quote unquote doctorate. I mean, it was from a degree mill in like a flyover state. But he used to have these debates, these like public debates that he would then like sell as DVDs. And so my brother actually got me into Creation versus Evolution by way of these DVDs from Dr. Dino from Ken Hovind. He eventually went to jail because he said it was God's money, but the government seemed to disagree when he wasn't paying his taxes. But another story, again, perhaps for later. So for me, like, I used to watch those and be like, yeah, why won't more academics, when I was an evangelical, why won't more academics, do these debates? Because a lot of people, he would say, like, wouldn't debate them. And it's true. Like, I think that there's so much that is impossible to communicate. There's so much like, there's just like, they don't have the ears to hear. Like there's a lack of willingness to just listen to another argument and like entertain it as a possibility, where they have this sort of, again, this like epistemic sort of inhumility or lack of humility, where they're like, no, I'm right. And I've already come to the conclusion. And now let me just go look at whatever I see in the world and make sure that it fits my theory about the world. And I think that, of course, like produces really bad scholarship from evangelicals, where like they come in with the answer as opposed to saying, here's evidence. Where does it lead me? And that's why we don't really find many evangelical sort of academics. And that's why I always find it funny at this point when we talk about like evangelical universities. I'm always like, oh boy, there's again sort of a contradiction in terms. So I think that for me, though, at this point, again, the research part of it, I'm still invested in. I still want to do that work. But I think in part why I've not switched to literature or like switched to creative writing, but I've put more of my time and investment into creative writing, is because I do find that like literature or a film or like TV, whatever it might be, whatever sort of artistic representation, oftentimes that is a better avenue to, if we are talking about changing someone's mind. It's not so much an argument as much typically, as much as it is seeing representation of something and saying, where it actually like draws upon not just the intellect, but also on like the heartstrings. And I think that with literature, for me, like with Shame, Sex, Attraction, the book that we started talking about, that I think, again, I don't think that it's going to change like almost anyone's mind. I think most people, A, will never read it. B, even if they were given a copy, they would probably not read it. They'd throw it out or give it back. Or they're just, even if they do read it, they're gonna be like, no, I already know that being gay is wrong, and even with this literature, it's not going to change anyone. But if I were to have some sort of hope or some sort of dream, which again I think is not really realizable, I would say that I would love for people to read it and then say like, like maybe reading someone's suffering and someone's experience, the way that when your friend was talking about his experience, that can pull on a heartstring and change you in a way that I think that the intellect can't. And again, evangelicals are so invested in emotions. Again, everyone's invested in emotions, but I think they are in a very particular way. And most of their beliefs come from their emotions and how they feel, from like a worship service or whatever. But I do think that that's one way of like, sort of like, it's like, what is it? Like Kierkegaard talks about this, like by indirection, like teaching by indirection and like convincing someone by indirection, not necessarily saying like, this is why you're wrong, but instead finding out like an indirect way or a roundabout way or a backdoor way of appealing to their sort of like sensibilities. That's perhaps a way that one can have more success in changing other people's minds. Because I'm with you, even though, my supervisor said what he said, and I think that he's right. I will nonetheless be that, I'll be Sisyphus rolling that rock up the hill, right? Like that sort of Sisyphean task of doing my best. And nonetheless, maybe one day someone will be convinced. Maybe one day by whether it be a post or a piece of, that I write or, a book that I write or a story, whatever, that someday maybe someone will be out there who will change their mind. And if that's the case, then that's, it's worth it. But I think that at the end of the day, I do unfortunately think that it's a fool's errand. But at the same time, I'm willing to be that fool if, in fact, it means that, out of those 99 sheep or the 100 sheep, that there's one sheep, found to draw upon a very familiar biblical, image. So that's my hope. But nonetheless, again, I don't think it's necessarily going to happen. But if it does, to be ironic, I guess, thank God.
Yeah, no, no, I'm with you. I mean, look, I wasn't convinced by being called a bigoted asshole online. I was convinced by people's stories, and then I ended up starting TNE, and here we are, So, like, you just don't know who you're reaching. It's frustrating. I don't like it. I wish it was a lot easier. It's not everyone's job, but I think that for those who have the bandwidth and the intent, we certainly have to try. So I think that's really important. Well, listen, I mean, Luke, I kept you way after our normal time. I appreciate you coming on. It was really good. I think we have to do a part 2 to this conversation for sure. We do a lot of other content. We go live pretty often. We do responses to videos. So happy to add you to the rotation of people to join us to unpack harmful Christian nationalist bullshit. It's always helpful to give people a better path forward by responding to it in credible ways. So if folks want to follow you online, is there a public profile people can find you at?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. I'm on Threads at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. Blue Sky at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. On Twitter, I'm Wilson_FW to keep it consistent. But I don't. No one's on Twitter, I guess, at this point. I still am technically, but I haven't posted in who knows how long. But otherwise, Facebook, LinkedIn, academia.edu. Those are probably the best ways. But Instagram is and Threads are typically the way that I communicate most, by really specifically Instagram.
Awesome. Love it. Well, Luke, again, great having you on. Let's keep in touch, and we'll do this again.
Amazing. Can't wait.